Well, welcome everybody to this Petroc Talks event. I'm Sean Mackney, Principal and Chief Executive at Petroc, and I'm your host and chair for this evening. Petroc Talks are designed to help us at Petroc College to address the big issues of the day that matter for our communities. And following such disruption in the normal patterns of learning that we're used to, there can be no bigger issue for us to discuss than the one which your esteemed panel is going to address today. What is the future of education post-COVID? And perhaps there's even a challenge in that question. Is there ever going to be a post-COVID age? We at Petroc took a lead in helping support education during COVID. We developed a modelling app with the University of Exeter for colleges to help them to keep their learners learning and their students safe. And over 100 colleges downloaded that app. But what will be the future of learning? What's going to be possible given the experiences we've had, and what's going to hold us back? What will enable the best learning possible as we enter what we hope to be the post-COVID age? So to answer these and any other questions that we have a brilliant panel of speakers for you this evening. Going around in order for me and in the order that people will be speaking, we have Dr. Lynda Broomhead, who is Head of Faculty of Academic and Scientific Studies here at Petroc College. Graham Hill, who's Head Teacher at Pilton Community College in Barnstable. Helen Whiterod, Assistant Head and INCO from Great Torrington School. Kerrian Ayers, National Head of Technical Education at the Education and Training Foundation. Dr. Ruth Weaver, Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning at the University of Plymouth. Tanya O'Connor, who's an alumnus of Petroc College and a trainee teacher at the moment. Welcome, Tanya. And Anna Drawer, who's a current Petroc student. So I hope you can see we're going to get a variety of perspectives on that big question for us, the future of education post-COVID. Each of our speakers is going to speak for just 5 minutes, and I've got my klaxon ready just here for them to give you their perspective on the question, and then we'll open the discussion out to questions from you. You can enter those through the YouTube and address them to the panel. I look forward to a lively debate. And so without further ado, our first speaker is ETF Technical Teaching Fellow and Head of our Faculty of Academic and Scientific Studies here at Petroc, Dr. Lynda Broomhead. Lynda, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening. Can you all hear me, just to check? Yep. Excellent. So what I wanted to do is just to spend 5 minutes really to review the impact COVID's had on both staff and students. And most of this is based on evidence from level 3 learners and a few adult learners. So how they have felt the impact, and obviously the staff that deliver that within academic and scientific studies. And then the other half of the presentation, just to look at what we think we can take forward from this, the positives, but also maybe some of the things that may be more barriers and challenges that we need to address moving forward. To look at the positives first in terms of the impact, I think as a manager of a team of staff and the students, I've been amazed at the resilience of both staff and students through this process, and it really it's reminded us just how resilient staff are. I'll come to maybe what that comes with in a minute, about their ability to adapt, to find solutions in quick time frames, but also to keep that focus on the learner and the outcome, despite what were our substantial distractions alongside. So I think, and also the students, you know, their ability to adapt and make change. And that's not just with new ways of learning, it's the environment they're working in, that, you know, and the changes in their social interactions, or almost no social interactions. So it's been amazing what people have been able to achieve. There's a little caveat with that coming up in a minute. And kind of tied in with that is also that those examples of problem solving and people wanting to find, they know what the outcome is, they know what we still want to achieve, and they found different ways to get there. and still get the outcome we want at the end. And I think that we underestimate how much of probably that goes on anyway, but a pandemic has brought that to the front, and I think there's some real things we can gain from that going forward. With the flip side of the resilience people have shown, I think it's also now particularly we're seeing the impact of how hard that is and the change fatigue attached to it. So we're very much seeing in both staff and students maybe different responses to new challenges, and still this constant dynamic environment we're in. And I think we've got to be really, when we look at education going forward, we've got to be mindful of that, to support people and to think about the long-term impacts and how their behaviours might be manifesting, because we've had this constant barrage of change and yeah, there's no consistency. Also, what we're noticing, I think more so this is pertinent to learners, is their confidence in their success and what they're able to do has diminished. They've had a lot less practice or exposure to things that may be normally part of their learning journey, and so therefore they second guess maybe, or are not so sure they're where they should be, and they're needing that level of reassurance, and obviously staff are having to provide that, and also to think about what we expose them to maybe in a different way, so they are prepared for the future. The other thing I think which has been quite demanding is the impact or the ability to stay focused on teaching and learning, because there's so many distractions. You know, as professionals, not only are we trying to get those outcomes of teaching and learning, we've also got to think about their mental health, their anxiety, the behaviours, the logistics of one-way systems and masks, and all of that. It becomes increasingly difficult to keep that focus. For sure, I think we've got a greater increase in the disadvantage gap, and that in a number of different areas, and we've got to be aware that's happened. And I also think there's a potential risk for inconsistency in how we catch up that disadvantage, and I think we've got to look for, when we look forward about with education, that we make sure that there is catch up for all. How am I doing for time, Sean?
You've got a minute left.
Perfect. So looking forward, I think there's real opportunity with digital and the variety it gives us in terms of how we can engage with our learning, and we can take forward the positive impacts and maybe change the way we've done things. I think there's greater opportunity and accessibility for all post-COVID, and the geographical reach, and we're not constrained to our local area. And I also think we've done a lot of work about how we assess now, not just because of the tag process, but it's also forced us to look back and say, how do we assess? Have we got this right? Because we've had to look at slightly different things through the tag process. And then the last thing, make sure that we've got support and catch up for all. And I think in the future, we've got to be very mindful that we do that for all. That's me done. Thank you.
Fantastic, Lynda. Yeah, and that for all of those in schools and colleges, the tag process, teaching assessed grades, has been yeah, another additional thing to be dealing with this year. Fantastic start for us. Our next speaker, one of the great things about Northern Devon is the way that the different educational institutions come together and share with each other their challenges and their responses to those. And one of those leading heads in our area that we're very privileged to work with is our next speaker, Graham Hill, head teacher at Pilton Community College. Graham.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sean. So I've done the usual teacher thing. I've written down all the questions and kind of put all the answers under the questions in exam fashion. So I'll go through with one of them, not to leave my training behind. So impact for us, goods and bads, kind of like Lynda has said, that we've had to rethink our pedagogy and embrace technology, which has been wonderful. You know, both staff and students have really embraced that, and that's something I'll come back to in a minute. What we found is that where we've managed to maintain routines and structure, parents and students have really welcomed that. And I think particularly through the first lockdown, lots of our students and families struggled. And then through the second lockdown, where we followed our same curriculum, live lessons, everything was much better from both staff perspective and the student perspective. I think what the pandemic has also done is highlighted the wide roles that schools and colleges undertake into regarding, the support of the students and families. And that's really come to the fore, as Lynda mentioned earlier, about kind of mental health awareness, that social interaction that we've got on that daily basis. And that's what a lot of families miss by going into that lockdown. So I think it's been good for the educational system to be viewed in that way, and then highlighted particularly to the powers that be, the wide range of skills that teachers bring to our communities in terms of keeping that together. The bad, and absolutely agree with Lynda on that, the gap between the disadvantaged has grown without doubt. We were very fortunate where, we managed to get all the funding available to enhance our IT provision and give students laptops, dongles to allow them to access the online learning. But what it didn't necessarily did was close that financial gap for those families that were suddenly disadvantaged through employment opportunities and work, and also where parents did have to go out to work, who was there to kind of support their children. And in kind of linking to that, another thing that we found in school was that socialization. That was the real thing that a lot of our students had difficulty with coming back into school after lockdown. What we found is that there was an increased use of social media, and then the downside of that, because social media has many positives, but for many young people, it is a distraction, and unfortunately also a method by which students do communicate inappropriately with each other. And so we had an increased number of issues relating to social media, and that spilt over into the community during lockdown, and obviously things that we've dealt with coming back into school. And one of the other things I think, and I really do feel for our students on that, is that kind of loss of those rites of passage that you get when you go through school, transition at the end of primary school into secondary, the end of secondary school moving on into FE. So you couldn't have those events, those whole school events, and that kind of cultural events that we often take our students out to. All that kind of stopped. So we have got a gap there, because Lynda talked about filling the gap, that for some things, unfortunately, you won't be able to fill. Knowledge gaps we can fill, cultural experiences and those experiential things, they're going to be a little bit more difficult to fill. So retaining from COVID, and Sean's mentioned this in his kind of opening introduction, the biggest kind of thing that we've got from COVID is the collaboration between all institutions. We've got the Barnstable Learning Community, NORDAB, which is all the heads in NORDAB, but also the wider across the whole of Devon and across the country, where as educational establishments have kind of actively supported one another. And probably for the first time in kind of my 30 years of teaching, it's been to that extent, because we've got the technology now. We all had a common kind of theme to get behind and support one another, and I'm hoping that continues. I know we've committed to that in North Devon, and it's something for our North Devon community to really focus upon, because although we're separate institutions, that we're not necessarily linked as parts of MATS and Trust, actually we can work together for the benefit of not only our students, our staff, but as I said, our community as well. So that's something I'm really hoping that kind of continues post lockdown. As a kind of standalone institution, we are going to keep some of those logistical changes that we've made in terms of teaching in certain areas, having groups of students together, remapping our social area. And the one thing that we are definitely going to continue to move on is our kind of use of IT as a platform. We use 365 and Teams, and we're already seeing the benefits that we're having that in terms of home learning, contact with parents, but also reducing workload, which is a big thing within the teaching community. We've kind of tried to keep parents involved throughout this lockdown, and again, IT has come into that. I think all the secondary schools now have virtual communication apps that they can use. So we hold our parents' evenings. We've had to have open evenings, all virtual. So all schools are trying to be as responsive as possible during a time where it is difficult without that face-to-face communication, because normally it's nice to be in a room to feed off each other, to get those kind of social cues and everything, but unfortunately we can't do that. So one of the other questions is, have things changed forever? In my opinion, not enough has changed forever. We've been given a real opportunity to reevaluate education and move it into the 21st century. And I don't think the powers that be have taken that opportunity. We seem to be settling back into a kind of Victorian-based EBAC system, which suits a very small minority of our kind of population. So that's, I think, an opportunity potentially missed. And I know that might be quite controversial to some, but something I believe in. The new normal will be segregated schools in regards to social phase-in. The phrase catch up and blended learning will come in to it. But on a positive side, I think, as Lynda said, that awareness of mental health and kind of support that we need to put not only for our students, but parents and the wider community as well, is again something that schools will be drawn into, and seeing whether or not social and health will work with schools to be able to do that. And one thing we've tried to do is try to kind of, because that phrase such as catch up generally means that there's a gap to be filled. There's only a gap to be filled if we draw back into the same situation that we're in. If we change our curriculum, change what we're expecting, there is no gap. And we've been trying to say that to our students because it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're always behind, then you're failing. Why would you come to school and fail at every opportunity that you'd be given because you've got to catch up? So we're telling them actually, out of any generation, they're probably the most skilled in the use of IT, in the use of a blended approach to work, working from home, working in school. So really focusing on those positives is something that we're trying to kind of really push to our students, to give that positive flip rather than constantly looking at the negatives that have been able to kind of come out of this kind of situation.
Great.
So priorities for the future for us. I'm sure my time must be up now. I'm speaking as fast as I can. Our sort of mannerism is just to ensure students have the skills, and that is academic, social, and health, to enable them to move through society and beyond school onto their next phase in the best possible way that we can. So I'll be quiet now. Sorry.
Thank you, Greg. Excellent way to finish. And interesting, as you say, perhaps we still have the opportunity to rethink the education piece. There's before COVID, we were talking about is it sensible to examine at 16 if that's not a sensible exit point? Maybe we could just continue not examining at that point. Well, I'm really pleased to get another perspective from one of our regional schools, Great Torrington School. Our next speaker, Helen Whiterod, who's Assistant Head and INCO. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, I just echo everything that Graham said, and anybody who knows at Great Torrington School will understand that at the moment we are really going through it. So just as we thought that we were coming out of this COVID thing, we've had to go into remote learning for 3 days because our cases have rocketed. So it's been a real challenge for us over the last 2 weeks. But actually, what it's done is embedded all our practice. So we've gone to remote learning. There was no fuss. It just happened overnight because everybody was practiced at what that looked like. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those pupils with additional needs, because part of my role is I am the SENCO at GTS, amongst other things. But I thought it might be helpful to talk about those children in particular. So we've got a higher than national average number of children with EHCPs at Torrington. So we've got 45 children with EHCPs. 16 of those are in year 7. So it's about 3 times the national average. The challenges we faced in the first lockdown, I would say a lot of parental challenges, because these children weren't really getting the support they needed at home through no fault of anybody, just the parents weren't able to provide the support they needed, and they the support that they would get in school, they weren't able to access that remotely. So they did find that extremely difficult, and it took my team of LSAs some time to work out how they could remotely support them. And as much as schools never close, actually against the media thinks we closed and had an extended holiday. None of us ever closed, and children with EHCPs had an entitlement to come in. But what we found was that parents and carers were quite fearful of them coming in because of COVID. So we didn't have a huge uptake of EHCP pupils in the first lockdown. We had more children in care and key worker pupils were accessing our provision. So it was being able to support them. And then also being mindful of staff workload, because we all suddenly had to move to this new way of working, and then expecting staff to offer those scaffolded, differentiated lessons within the main class, which they would normally do, but staff do rely quite heavily on the LSAs, because the LSAs know those children probably better than anybody in the school. So there was that kind of element which took a little bit of time. And then, of course, we came back in September. I think, listening to our two previous speakers, it just triggered something in me that most of our children with EHCPs, not all, most of them, they don't have that flexibility of thought that other children may have. So those changes were a real challenge for them. And coming back, and we were in bubbles, having to bubble my LSAs with children. So really being kind of restrained on where I could put my team. So I've got my team who are specialists in certain areas, but I had to bubble them with a year group. So that was a real impact on the progress of those learners. Not being able to run intervention groups because we weren't able to mix class bubbles. So in Key Stage 3 we had class bubbles, so not being able to pull children from different classes to do interventions, that's had an impact. Sorry, just looking at my notes as I talk. The one thing that was really evident to me in my role as Senko was the number of parents who would contact me, particularly in the first lockdown, to say, I think my child's got a learning need. I've never recognised it before, but I've noticed now that they can't write legibly, or they've got slow processing, or they can't read, or so. And we did a lot of discussion about this at school, and kind of come to the conclusion that we don't think children suddenly developed these learning needs in lockdown, but what they didn't have was their peer support and that those cues from people around them. And so it became more obvious to parents that actually, there might be a level of difficulty there. So changes that we have kind of embedded since the first lockdown is, so into the second lockdown, we changed the way we do our remote learning. So we started with Show My Homework. We're now on OneNote. And actually that was a real benefit for my team, because they can be added as a member of the class group, so they can offer that remote support. And again, like I say, this week, these last 3 days, it's been brilliant, because everybody, including, but I had to remind myself how to use OneNote, because I've not used it for a few months, but it was kind of there and ready to go. The other thing that I found difficult is statutory timelines of education healthcare plans, because last year it was almost like just hold off on it for a little bit, but then we were getting behind, and being able to actually evaluate the progress the child's made towards their outcome. It's really tricky, because they're not really making that progress because they're not with us. And then offering parents, a number of parents weren't happy to carry out reviews remotely, so they wanted to wait until we could have people in school again. So everything's been quite disjointed. Some of our children absolutely loved lockdown school. So some of my children with the HCPs, particularly those on the autism spectrum, loved it. And then we had the difficulty of getting them back into normal school. So the second lockdown, we had a huge uptake of pupils. Like, it was almost like we had a full school. It was quite ridiculous at some points. But then, like I say, the biggest challenge was preparing some of them for actually everybody will be back next week. But some of them really enjoyed that. They're on a computer and they just got on with their own work, and that suited their needs. Echoing exactly what everybody else has already said, though, our biggest challenge is the lack of socialization. That's what we're facing all the time, the lack of socialization and the impact on their well-being. And I think it's going to take years before we really see the impact of this. We're noticing our year 7 in particular, it took us a good term to break them in the nicest way, because they just didn't understand what it was like to be around so many other children. And that was, part of my other role is transition, because we weren't able to run transition. They weren't able to meet their peers before they came in September, and it took a long time for them to settle as members of GTS. So hope that's okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Really interesting perspective on both the kind of unexpected opportunities that came for those learners with special educational needs, as well as the challenges for them in this period. Well, our next speaker, moving to a kind of national stage now, is Kerrian Ayers, who's National Head of Technical Education at the Education and Training Foundation. Kerrian, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to join this evening. So I work at the Education and Training Foundation that offers workforce development for the further education and skills sector. And basically, my perspective is that prior to COVID, we were already in a time of change, post-Brexit, and also thinking about needing to increase skills, to improve life chances and earning potential, but also to meet the needs of employers so we could ensure sustainability in our economy. And so basically what we have found during this time is that there has been an increased uptake in continuing professional development. Online has aided that because obviously you could get more reach and engagement. But what it's allowed is that it's allowed networking. So when people have found solutions to how they could work, there's been wider dissemination and sharing. People have been able to access EdTech and digital skill updating, because before we could work with our learners, of course, teachers needed to upskill, as did leaders and managers, so that they could actually deliver high quality teaching and training and strategically plan for how they were going to cope. So EdTech has had a huge uptake, and we haven't taken the eye off the ball as a sector working with schools and employers and partners for thinking nothing stopped because of COVID. You know, there had to be how are strategic leaders and managers working to address increasing apprenticeships and T-levels? How are we recruiting the teachers for delivery of our technical education? And perhaps one of the positives of COVID has been that many people who've been furloughed or perhaps needed to retrain and upskill have decided to bring their technical expertise into FE technical teaching. That's been a real positive. There's also been huge support for SEND through our Centres of Excellence, English and Maths and digital skill support, and support for the FE sector in terms of mental health and well-being. So CPD has been rich and engaged with. Now, some of the learning I'd like to share from a student perspective, if you look at all the sort of COVID-19 surveys, is that lots of learners were talking about their inability to access learning and how we needed to get kit to them and how we needed to make it more accessible and inclusive. But many of them also told us that they would like to better understand their progression pathways. Some of them have been totally inspired by people they've seen in roles during COVID, NHS workers, research and development, engineers who built the ventilators and the PPE equipment. And in fact, a latest survey has shown 52% of 10 to 18-year-olds are now considering a career in STEM. Hugely important. But yet, you know, we have 62% of 16 and 17-year-olds feeling that they think that STEM compared to non-STEM subjects are difficult. And obviously, it's where careers, education, advice and guidance begins at younger ages. They said they would like opportunities for closer encounters with employers that are meaningful. And we're all working to implement the Gatsby benchmark. So it's how we do that. They want to know what qualifications they should do to get to the jobs in the sectors that they want to work in. And quite a lot of the work that we need to be doing now, so thinking about the future and the positives coming out of this and the investment that's coming, is the locality working. We've just seen the FE white paper and skills for jobs. There's a real opportunity for schools with colleges, other FE providers, universities, employers and other stakeholders to be working together to address progression of our local students, in informing them of the opportunities there are locally in local companies and what sectors they can progress into in the future. So there's a lot of emphasis needs to be on careers, education, advice and guidance, and FE working back to primary, secondary, and making the most of this disruption and thinking now full focus has been on collaboration and partnerships, There's funding coming for education to work closer with industry, so we can prepare students with the knowledge, skills, behaviours and competencies for the workplace so we can meet employer needs. And I would say, because this is my home territory too, we're better than to do this than in North Devon, because we're within the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, the first designated in the UK, one of 714 in the world. That's about how do we live in harmony with our environment? How do we give people better standards of living? And so we should be practicing and experimenting with sustainability with all our partners. And here in North Devon is where this can begin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kerrian. And we'll pick up this in the questions as well. There's a question we've got around not just the kind of how of education, but what's that education for in the post-COVID world? And, you know, you've painted a picture there of internationally connected, making impact locally, but also that helps us develop perhaps sustainable behaviours and practices that will see a different future for our whole world rather than just for our immediate short-term future. Great. On to our next speaker then. Fantastic and different perspectives from people. It's really interesting. Next speaker are at Petroc. We've got a long-standing partnership with the University of Plymouth, so really pleased to have our next speaker, Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning from the University of Plymouth, Dr. Ruth Weaver. Ruth, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm pleased to be able to say that we could all be in the same room saying exactly the same thing. So everything that has been said echoes and sort of resonates in our context. So what the comments Lynda was making, like I said, actually exactly the same. And the comments that have come up, I think, about the way in which technology has been useful, the importance of the social context for learning, for learners of all kinds. And those are kind of very kind of, my points. I've written down, as Graham has, my answers in best exam fashion at this time of year. And so I'll just pick and choose, because many of the positive things I have to say have already been picked up on. So my role as Associate Dean, I work in the Faculty of Science and Engineering. So that's a similar background, I think, to many people here. My role is to kind of look after curriculum development, to do the kind of the day-to-day hands-on stuff about academic standards, but also to be looking forward to what might the future look like for science and engineering over the next 5 to 10 to 30 years. And alongside that, I'm also teaching, so I'm kind of in working with students every day as well. I think the differences perhaps is one of scale. So I just finished teaching a group of 120 odd students who most of the year have been little black squares on a screen. And I have missed that contact with them, and I think their learning has not benefited from that kind of that distancing. Anyway, to go on to some major points about sort of positive and negative, and then what that means for us in the future. And positive things that have come out from COVID. So this is very much a retrospective view. It's taken some time to identify things that are positive, and I think might be true for all of us. I would say the positives that I can see come more for me at the institutional level. The negatives, I think, are more at the kind of granular level of what it really means for an individual student. So the positives for us is that when we have to, at an institution, we can act quickly, coherently, and collectively. I'd say somewhat to our surprise, we've been able to do that. So we were scrabbling a bit, I think, as everybody was in March 2020. But over the next few months, we were able to get ourselves together and have, I think, quite a good offer for our students starting in the autumn of 2020. So that was a positive. I think another positive that has arisen, not deliberately, but has arisen, is our appreciation as an institution of the different facets of our institution. So for quite a long time, the only place that our students were able to access on campus was the library. So the library was their academic home. And actually the face of the university to the students was the library. The only staff they were able to interact with in person. So it became much more prominent in our thinking, I think, than it had been previously. On digital tools, so this is something that's been mentioned by a lot of people. I think we found they were more manageable than we thought they would be. People are more confident in using them, and that has been a big plus, because we had to learn how to use them and just get on and do that. I'm interested in the comments that are made about disadvantage and that gaps have been widening. In that some of the literature that's coming out at university level is that some of the measurement of awarding gaps and progression and success along a variety of indicators suggests that in some cases those gaps are narrowing. So it'd be interesting to see what that looks like. I don't know what that looks like locally for us. On the negative side, and so as Kerrian mentioned, that we have loads of information available to us at a national level. So there's quite a recent Sutton Trust report. There's an organisation called the Higher Education Policy Institute who have published today their routine academic experience of students survey. There's also the Student Futures Commission. There are all kinds of surveys, as well as what we know I've learned ourselves. From my own experience, I would say students are anxious. Students are anxious about minor things. So this is not, I'm not really talking here about a substantial increase in more serious mental health issues that we've seen. I think probably we have all seen that. But I'm really talking about students who are managing, but they are anxious about really quite minor things. And that has led to a flurry of maybe emails where a quiet word after a class or in a break in a class would have been sufficient to help those students, to reassure those students. And it's not the same as hanging on a Zoom call to talk to students, because that's a much more public forum. And I think that I regret not having that opportunity to speak informally to students to reassure those, get rid of those issues before they became big ones. I would say I found teaching much harder in this situation because the students are anonymous. You can't look at a class and think, are they awake? Are they asleep? Are they interested? Are they understanding? And adjust in response to that. So as a result of that, if we had to say, have students learned as well and as much? I think probably not. We've done the very best we can, but it's not been the same. The other thing for us is that we found, from what students have said, that learning is only one part of being at university. Learning from us, from teachers, is definitely only one part of that. They learn from each other, the social interactions, the sports, the whole thing of being a student is something that the students have missed out on. So some of our students, so we have a great variety of experience. So we have medical students who've been here all the way through, pretty much. Their education has been different, but it has continued. But we had other students in humanities who just have not been able to have any face-to-face teaching at all, as the government has given priority to different students. And for those students who haven't been back on campus since Christmas, I think the social aspect, for different reasons, has been really important to them. So what does this mean for us going forward? Firstly, I think we can take big steps forward if we want to. So we've had to do it, and we can do it again as an institution. As a result, for me, I think that means we should be more ambitious in what we want to do. There was a comment about progression. So for example, I know that Petroc is starting a new foundation degree in environmental management, I think soon, I think September, and there would be a progression route for those students to a degree programme at Plymouth. So normally we'd think, well, those students from Petroc would physically locate to Plymouth, but I know that that's not possible for everybody. So with our new experience, our new knowledge of digital technology, maybe we could look at delivering a progression opportunity for those students in a very different way. So we're already thinking about that. So we'll be back to you, Sean, about that, to look at the detail of that later. So those are a couple of things, more ambitious. A third one is blended learning is here to stay. Blended learning will be normal, but for us to augment in-person learning and to replace it in particular contexts, but to augment it primarily. A point about being ambitious is that personally I feel much more confident about dealing with change. there is no one of the questions for us is, what is normal? There is no normal, is there? There's just more change. So we're looking at the skills for jobs. We're looking at the comprehensive spending review. We're looking at what the government's view on what university education is for, in this, all of those kind of things, and there's just more change coming. So I think Lynda started talking about resilience, and I think as a result of this experience, we are collectively more resilient. There was another comment there, and I'm afraid I can't remember where it came from. Helen, I think, was that there will be a lag effect in some of the impacts that we see. So we're interested in thinking about how school students have been impacted and what will that mean for their transition into higher education. We don't know really about what that will look like for them. We do know that there are gaps in our students' knowledge, skills, and confidence, because they've missed out on things over the experiential components over the last 12 months. And I think we won't really see what that will mean for them for a little while to come. I think that's all I had to say, Sean, so I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic, thank you, Ruth. Some really interesting points there, and people picking these up in the chat as well. I'm logging the questions, and so we'll be coming back to you with those. Right, our next speaker, I'm really pleased to say one of the two people who've actually experienced this as a learner through this, and in our next speaker's case, come out the other side and is still interested in education. So very pleased to hand over now to Tanya O'Connor. Tanya is, as I say, an alumnus of Petroc and now a trainee teacher. So Tanya, over to you.
Hiya, thank you, Sean. First of all, I'd just like to sort of go on from what Ruth was saying about actually we was quite lucky in the sense of when we started university in 2020, we were able to sort of have 5-6 weeks on site, and it allowed us to sort of collaborate with other students that were going through the same thing. So I think if that had been done online, it would have been a completely different outcome. We got to know people that were going through the same thing. However, going into school as a first year trainee teacher in the November, obviously they were keeping their children safe. So we were kind of shoved at the back and we were made to wear masks and we weren't allowed to interact with children, which then made teaching in May really difficult because we weren't given that training. We didn't know what to do. And then also returning back in May as a trainee teacher, we were told, okay, now you've got to teach once a week, which we had the support of the mentors, which was fantastic. But we felt like we were shoved in the deep end a bit because we were still teaching with our mask on, which was quite difficult because I was in a private school, so year 3 and 4, I found that they didn't really want to listen because you can't give those facial expressions out. They found it quite difficult. I think also during my own experience of the second lockdown from January onwards, I was also homeschooling 4 children as well. So 2 secondary school children, 2 primary school children, and doing a degree. And I found that so overwhelming. I must admit, I mean, the support was, very grateful. I couldn't have got any more support if I wanted. But my concerns really are just, will I know how to teach post-pandemic? If this carries on and I've only got another 2 years left, will I know what to do when COVID's gone? And that's really difficult. I've spoken to a couple of my other peers that also the pros of lockdown were when they were staying in halls, they were with people that they didn't necessarily know. They'd only met them a few weeks and then they were locked down with these people. So again, going on what everybody else has said, it had a massive mental health impact. And also with my own experience with my 2 older children, they're taking their GCSEs next year and they've hardly been in school. So they've now got the pressure of doing these GCSEs, but without having the learning behind them. And what will happen next year? Is it going to be another case of 2 weeks before, teachers need to reassess it? And I just feel like we need to get into the 21st century, find some other way apart from these standardized tests, which is only a snapshot of what these children are capable of. Because why not follow university courses and colleges courses and give them the 2 years to grow, give them time to improve? Because a GCSE paper is just a small snapshot of what they are capable of, really. And yeah, it's just really hard for them. I don't think I really have anything else to say, to be honest. I've only done a year, so.
No, I mean, that's fascinating, Tanya. I mean, and your experience of how to learn and develop into a new teaching role when you haven't had you haven't been able to get that grounding in being able to use all of your kind of expressive features is, as you say, learning as a newly qualifying teacher with masks on must be really challenging. And I know one of the things that people say about, as we think about blended working in lots of organizations, is that if people are based at home, yes, there are a lot of kind of advantages and people can get quiet time, but it's missing out on those informal kind of mentoring things, the connections about how you deal with particular issues, which you don't necessarily pick up. So thank you, Tanya. And last and not least, I'm really pleased to say that our next speaker is a current Petroc student, so it's with some trepidation I have to say that she comes and speaks. Next speaker learning with us at Petroc at the moment, and to again address these questions about what that's been like and how she sees it. Anna Drawer, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. So I just wanted to talk a bit about my perspective from last year as a year 11 whose GCSEs got cancelled all the way through to where I am now, because originally when lockdown first hit, I was a year 11. I was meant to be taking my exams in a month and a half, and suddenly they were cancelled. And I really didn't get much from my school. I didn't hear much, and I had no online learning because there was nothing left to learn. So I know that was quite challenging with trying to find my own routine and what to then do then. But then when I started in the autumn, I didn't know what it was like to be at college without COVID rules. So all the one-way systems and everything, I found very easy to get the hang of because I didn't know what it was like before. And with the whole online digital learning, especially in lockdown in the winter, there were some good things, there were some bad things. I know from talking to some people in my class, some of them didn't get any live lessons really for some of their subjects in lockdown, which then made that very hard to learn because they were basically teaching themselves. But all of my lessons were live, and luckily my subjects that I'm doing are nice and easy to learn online because there isn't too much interactive stuff because I do maths and physics. So it was nice and easy to learn online, and my classes are very small, so it was again easy to have conversations in a kind of online perspective. But I mean, some of the good things, so for me it takes 40 minutes to get to college. I could spend that time working. Like if I was straight after lessons, I was still in the flow of learning and I could just keep working, which was really, really quite nice. And there were some interactive online things, like on Zoom, you've got a whiteboard where anybody in the call can write on it. So we did some things like that where we were writing, and our teacher would put a question and we would just doodle down what we thought about it, which was also quite nice to do. And I hope that technology is things like that are still used in the future, even post-COVID, because they were really quite useful and quite nice to do. And I mean, some of the things that weren't so good were, I think I felt I got a bit far behind in some of my subjects. And when we came back after lockdown, it became very clear which bits I hadn't been able to concentrate on as much and which bits I clearly didn't keep in my mind, which then caused quite a bit of pressure because I then had mocks last week. So I was working towards those, and I was kind of making sure that everything that I'd lost in lockdown was up to the standard of everything that I had learnt in person. And I mean, lockdown was, there were good things and there were bad things. And when we first came back, we were straight back into every week online, every week in person, which we hadn't been before. So that was also really weird, because there were some people who I had never met before who were in my classes, because they were on Zoom when I was in person when we were doing the 1 week in, 1 week out. So, but because my classes were small, there weren't very many people, but it was quite weird to have a fuller classroom. But we've all adjusted to that by now, and we're all getting quite used to what it's like now. But it would be nice for all the restrictions to lift, and then we can all be a bit more relaxed about what we're doing. And I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I'm really interested. I mean, a couple of things on that. We've heard recently learners back in for mocks, preparing for that formal exam situation, and the way that you feel when you enter a big hall of lots of little tables all laid out in a big kind of grid. Some of the learners that we've got coming through have never experienced that because they didn't have it for 2 years, and so the stress associated with that was something quite different. And also that transitional period between, I think it was Graham talked about the transitions between primary to secondary to college. One of the things we tried to do at Petroc, working with our local schools, was use some artificial intelligence informed learning platforms that would help year 11s to make that transition and customize the approach, personalize the approach to learning around them. So there are I guess some opportunities that come with those things, but also, as you say, some challenges. Right. Now, panel, we've got a number of questions in the chat on the right-hand side, which I will pick some things up through, and they're still coming in here. First, a question from Joe, which is about the way that we might learn. Joe says, should we consider a hybrid model of learning that perhaps allows some students to learn from home on a permanent basis? Helen, I don't know whether you want to take that one first. You mentioned, how some of your learners actually really took to this learning environment.
Yeah, they did. However, I think personal opinion, a little bit more than professional opinion, I think every child needs to access the school environment and school life, because it's a training ground for life. And the pupils we had who enjoyed the lockdown school were the pupils who don't tend to socialize. They don't tend to, they don't want to have friends. They're quite happy in their own little bubble. So academically, it might be the right thing, but socially and developing fully functioning adults, not so sure. But I think, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because as schools, we're constrained by what the government is telling us we have to do. We would love this flexibility, but actually we're battling directives all the time.
Yeah, and then there's a question about trust in this, isn't there? Perhaps if our educators were trusted to produce the assessments here, why are we not trusted to craft fully flexible, personalised learning for the learners in front of us? Ruth, you wanted to come in on this question, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I just wanted to say that this is something we've been discussing quite a lot as well, because quite a lot of our students come from around the southwest, and they'll travel quite a distance to come to their learning. The experience that we've had suggests that it's actually very difficult to do well. So if you are wanting to have students present in a classroom and then remotely accessing that classroom, you typically need somebody who is managing the process of the remote learners, can't bring them in so that they can feel part of the learning. So we have programs in nursing that are delivered at different sites in Plymouth, Truro and Exeter. And some of those classes run simultaneously in a hybrid mode. And it's a skill. It's much more than we might think. So it is something that is that happens certainly within our context. I think it would be very challenging to have the main body of students in the classroom and just a few remotely, for them to really have the feeling of being fully involved in the education. So I think originally we thought it might be a solution, but in practice we're stepping back from it while we learn how to do it properly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kerrian, I wonder whether you might come in on this, because some people have argued that because there's a potential kind of backlash against digital. They said, "Oh, we don't have to do that anymore, and it's not as good." But do you think that that's the case, or is it just that some of us have had 20 years of learning to be an in-person educator? We might have had 12 months of being a digital one. We just haven't yet developed the techniques and the skills that Ruth was talking about.
For sure, what we can see for the demand for CPD is that everybody is continuing to learn. Many have had a steeper learning curve than others, moving from awareness to embedding to impactful teaching and learning, and being able to be interactive and managing that learning, as Ruth has said. I think we're on a journey. Teachers are on a journey, not just for upskilling in terms of use of technology for learning, but with my sort of thinking about technical education, when we are working with learners in those kinds of programs, apprenticeships, T-levels, it's also we need to become au fait with what technologies are being used in the workplace that are shaping working practices and bringing those back into the classroom. So it's technology for learning, but technology for the workplace, and upskilling in its entirety. But also coming back to, one of the things I really think needs to happen is thinking we as educators can think, what do we think is the best learning experience for students? But actually, we've talked about all the national surveys and so on, but locally, what would North Devon learners in schools and colleges say about how they would like to learn? Is it face-to-face? Is it online? Is it blended? Is it hybrid? How that locality-based surveying of meeting the needs of our learners, that's interesting to me. And everyone doing that as locality-based project to meet needs. I'll probably just leave it there to let somebody else come in. Yeah.
No, and that Graham, I wonder if I can bring you in and move on to one of the other questions slightly. And Lynda and Michelle asks that we've talked about how we do education, but she asked what's education for in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Should we be rethinking the purposes of education for the world that our learners are going to be facing?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we do. I think, when you look at other countries where systems are potentially more progressive than our own, they take into account all the aspects of the child, the socialization, the community aspects, not just an ability to recite a fact 2 years down the line, sitting at a desk in a sports hall. There's much more to education than just the kind of regurgitation of knowledge. And I think that's the opportunity that we've got now, that we are, people have talked about kind of developing people that are going to be fit for the 21st century, whether that's work fit, socially fit, aware of our environment, being active, taking those active roles. And I think, if we can step back a bit from the exam factory that unfortunately many schools have become, and some, trusts are really promoting, and just think of that whole person and the wider person in terms of the skills they need to be, as Helen said, a functioning adult out in the community. That's what we should be focusing on. And we've got an opportunity to do that if we take, I think, some of the, and it will be a big step and a brave step. I do appreciate that. And there is a need to know someone's educational capabilities, moving on through kind of higher and further education. But there is much, and I'm sure, Ruth will say that actually, yes, academic skills are good, but, do they take over from resilience and those other softer skills that you need to actually get through university? We know dropout rates in university are very high. And some of those people that drop out have amazing an academic background, but not necessarily the wider skills to cope with a university lifestyle, moving away from home, because we don't teach that. We don't necessarily prepare that in school, particularly, pre-16, for those students to move on to university that have those skills.
Yeah, Lynda, thank you, great. Lynda, you got a perspective on this. You know, and a number of speakers are going to touch on, well, what's education for? Actually, maybe we need to be bolder and re-envisaging the purposes of education.
And I think this whole pandemic has kind of brought to the forefront that what educational institutions do for the community around and the role they play. It's absolutely more than those qualifications that open doors, and I think that's potentially where the positive impact of, say, digital might be, and these hybrid models. Can we use them to have the impact here? Ruth was saying we want to do it well, so is there an opportunity to learn as practitioners to do this well? And then what that opens up is that we then instill in our learners those skills. They learn to take more control of their learning. They don't have to have it in 9 till 10 on Monday because they're learning this. Learning happens everywhere, and they become more reflective, and they're more aware of the opportunities they have, and that every experience in life, you know, it's part of them growing as a person. And if we can break away with digital from the I only learn when I'm in this room and I'm doing this, and everything becomes a bit more of a learning experience, that's where digital could come in. And, you know, as an FE sector, I think particularly we are that stepping stone to, if they go on to university or the world of work, they need that independence, and they need the confidence and had some experience and how to manage themselves. And so I think this is an opportunity where we need to drive that rather than having so much focus on the qualification. And I think there's been some little windows and glimmers of where that might work, and it's building on that and getting expert at harnessing the positive impacts, and not just substituting from face to face to digital, where the positive impact could be.
And Tanya, I'm going to bring Helen in a second. Tanya, just on that question of a different approach to learning. You're seeing it both as an educator, but also with your children at different stages. Do you think we should be taking a different step and thinking differently about what that education is for?
From a personal perspective, I think children learn better in school. The face-to-face contact is certainly, you can see it. For example, when I went back on my second placement in November and spoke to my mentor, he was saying that year 4 students had forgotten simple things in English like capital letters and full stops, because they assumed that they're known at home, but because they're not reinforced on a daily basis, children just so easily forget. And I know with my children, I can sort of see the gap widening as well when they've had to spend time at home. And I'm training to be a teacher, and I have some skills to enable some of the teaching that their teachers would do. But I found it extremely difficult. So for a parent that wouldn't necessarily have them skills, it must be horrendous. And also, if them children are learning in a home environment, what is going to happen when they need to go to face-to-face teaching? Because it's going to be a different style of teaching. There's going to be rules in place and everything like that, that then again leads on to the workplace. So no, I mean, face-to-face teaching is better from a personal opinion.
Yeah. Helen?
Yeah, I just want to, I think the idea of digital learning is fabulous, but we need to remember that some of us are in rural North Devon, where contact with the internet is we did our virtual parents evening. It was easier to talk to my sister-in-law in Canada than to talk to a family who live in Dalton, and that is the barrier that we face living as lucky as we are to live here. I just wanted
no, that's a very good point. Anna, Graham talked about how learners had valued the structure that that school and college is able to bring to their learning. Lynda's saying give our learners more control. Where do you sit on this?
Personally, I'm quite a fan of structure. When everything kicked off last spring, I very quickly made my own kind of daily timetable, and every single day for me was the same. And I always made sure that I did some work so that I didn't fall behind to start my A-levels and things like that. But that was when I didn't really have any input from any kind of school or educational area. So some control in some areas is nice because then you can do what you want to do. But overall, I'd rather have a given structure that I can stick to and always know what I'm going to be doing next.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. And interesting, as you were saying, Tanya, about what are we preparing our learners for? Preparing them for work when they're working in structured environments is one thing. Back to Michelle's point, if actually the world of work and their lives are going to be changing constantly, then how are we preparing our learners effectively? I want to move on to a couple of other questions. One from Ian here. Ian asks that if there has been this developing gap for disadvantaged students, as a number of you have said, how can we narrow that gap for those students going forward? And a related point, Joe says, is there good data on that definite gap in learning? Ruth, I don't know whether you want to come in first on this one. Yeah, how do we close that gap? Is there good data out there that says that's there?
So at the university level, we have kind of various metrics that we are various gaps of the type of students that come to university, how well they do at university, whether they stay in university, and what kind of employment they go on to. And so we are measured and judged on all of those criteria. And I haven't looked at this locally, but nationally, the work suggests that some of those gaps are closing, primarily as a result of the change. So I would say primarily as a result of the changes in assessment that we've put in place. So none of our students has sat an in-person exam. Well, a few perhaps, but so we've gone to 48-hour open book assessments. And I should say, I'm also speaking as a parent here of one of my youngest child has just finished his final year of university under this regime. And I would say it's massively beneficial to him. So the evidence that we have that at the moment is only in reports that say this phenomenon is occurring, suggests that change to the assessment regime has reduced some of the gaps that we see in higher education. Obviously, we don't have the same breadth of students coming into higher education that are in different forms of education. So we need to look at the particular context that we're talking about.
Yeah,
I would just say that we would typically have seen the advantages. There are advantages and disadvantages to those changes in assessment, but I think they are more likely to stay for us because we have the enormous advantage of being able to determine our own assessment regime so that it better suits our students. And we found that if you take an assessment task that is meant to be helping students to learn, then these type of more flexible assessments help students learn more effectively rather than just judging what they know on the day. It's going off a slightly different tangent there, Sean, but the evidence that we had suggested to us is that the types of attainment gap we're judged on in higher education are closing.
That's fascinating. Graham, you wanted to come in on this point, I think.
Yeah, what we found is we've kind of done a lot of measurement on engagement throughout the whole process. So, and that's one advantage of doing something digitally. You can kind of track engagement, etc. And what we found is that the engagement of our disadvantaged reduced. Actually, when you narrow that down and break that down, actually, the engagement of our ASC students, so those on the autistic spectrum, actually improved. And I think that's potentially one of the gaps that Helen was talking about, or one of the groups, that Helen was talking about, that actually preferred the kind of online learning aspect of that. And so when we looked at their attendance pre-lockdown to engagement during lockdown, actually that was better for that group of children. But when you look at the wider aspects, it was slightly down for boys in comparison to girls, in comparison with normal school attendance. But generally, our more vulnerable students, the engagement levels was lower, and that's we're doing kind of, if you like, end of year kind of tests at the moment, and we're envisaging that those gaps will be slightly wider. Those gaps in learning and knowledge will be slightly wider for our disadvantaged children. That's the kind of data that we're collecting in as a school at the moment.
Yeah, and Kerrian.
Yeah, I think you know, it's really important that we take a look at the evidence base that's out there and look at it by sector. So I'll just play it back in terms of one sector. Let's think about engineering. Think about engineering manufacturing contributing 43.5% to our global, you know, our UK economy, and how important it is going to be to have engineers. We need 57,000 jobs per year in terms of engineers, but only in terms of engineering, only 12% of women, you know, represented within those engineers. And for lower socioeconomic groups and Black and ethnic minority groups, 6 to 8% of engineers. So actually lots of initiatives are going on, but you need to kind of look by sector rather than global reports. Royal Academy of Engineering, Engineering UK, IET, you know, within any one sector, there's so much rich evidence base coming out. And just to flag one thing, if you think of motorsports, it's initiatives like Lewis Hamilton starting to work with RAEng and thinking about how you get more Black and ethnic minority groups and lower socioeconomic groups thinking about motorsports in every level. Not that you would be a Formula One driver, but higher technical engineering and so on. And how do you get anyone interested in engineering? And actually, you know, just to play whack one thing, you know, it starts with, and reports show, knowledge of engineering and what engineering's careers could be starting in primary school. You know, you can be an engineer in the fashion industry, a software engineer in ASOS. You know, it's not all about the oily rags and so on, you know, offshore marine, renewables, all sorts of jobs for all sorts of people, because engineers make a difference and find the solutions to everyday life for us. So, do you know, I think it comes with enriched and enhanced learning opportunities. And that begins again with partnerships and collaborations with schools and colleges and employers and stakeholders, inspiring the next generation to progress to higher levels of technical learning and employment.
And has our Lynda, has our experience of under COVID actually brought our world a bit closer together, so that being able to make contact with people in those roles, seeing those role models, rather than going, I think I want to be a software engineer, but I've never met one, that we can contact one and be on a Zoom call with them probably that afternoon. I mean, how can we grasp that potential from our digital experience for the future?
I think that was the little comment I made about accessibility and going outside our geographical range. It's exactly that. That's where the positive impact of digital learning is. It makes the whole world accessible. You know, we don't even have to stay within the UK bounds. And I think what there is out there now increasingly is the sectors are putting together information, virtual work experience, things that our learners can engage with, and using technology to actually have more of an experience that we can possibly facilitate face to face. And I think that's the exciting bit, as you know, as Kerrian was saying, that we can open up the doors and show. I mean, I know we're still going to do a trip to CERN, we'll still do those physical things, COVID permitting, but we can add extra value in terms of different experiences. And I think the other thing as well is it allows a safe environment for young people to maybe try something they're not sure about and make an informed decision with like a virtual work experience. It's not as risky for them. They might be willing to take that opportunity, see what it's like, rather than going to a place and then not liking it and having that awkwardness of not wanting to turn up. It allows you to explore things and maybe take more opportunities because you're not so worried about if it doesn't work, because virtual doesn't feel quite as scary.
Really interesting. And I think we could talk all evening about some of the things that have come out of this. I want to, in the last kind of 90 seconds that we've got, I want to go around each of us because just one thing that you're hopeful about for the future in terms of education. We've talked about the challenges, we've talked about gaps and things. What one thing are you hopeful about? Graham, I'm going to come to you first.
Continual collaboration. I think, what's got me through this is that kind of collaboration, speaking, to people like yourselves in the call, but other leaders, other teachers, because when, we have suddenly dropped into some of these situations that we've been in, having those people around us to kind of support, touch base with, kind of bounce ideas off, that's been essential. And I think as long as we continue to collaborate, and particularly, in North Devon, where sometimes that's been hard because, as you say, internet speeds, but also other, geographically it's difficult. That collaboration, that's the one thing I really hope we can maintain moving forward.
Yeah. Fantastic. Tanya?
I think for me, it's the idea of mental health will not have that stigma against it anymore, and people will start recognising that it's just as bad as physical health.
Yeah. No, excellent. Thank you. Ruth?
I'd like to see the kind of optimistic can-do attitude that we've developed because we had to be maintained.
Lovely. Yeah, I'm really with you on that. Helen?
Just echo what Tanya said. Really, I'd like, GTS isn't a results factory, but we are judged on our results, and I'd like to see more understanding of the whole child rather than just the results at the end of year 11.
Yeah. Kerrian?
A little like Graham, I would say, collaboration, but partnerships, but also the continued investment to make partnerships possible through government funding, which I'm seeing.
Yeah, no, great. Lynda?
Graham pinched mine. I was hoping you're going first. So absolutely collaboration, but as backup is greater opportunity, making that world smaller so it's more accessible.
Excellent, thank you. And last word, quite appropriately, to the learner. Anna, what one thing are you hopeful about for the future?
I think that with the mental health side is just getting more of an understanding of all of the kind of pressures that can go into the stress of a student, whether it's COVID or something else.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. Those of you who have been watching through YouTube, thank you to all of our panel. Really stimulating day. And I think a lot for us to be hopeful about that we're left with at the end of today. It's been a challenge. We've learned a lot, and there's a lot for us to apply for the future. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again at our next Petroc Talks. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.